Welcome to The Explainer. So, right now we are facing this massive tension in the digital world. AI data scraping. These models are constantly sweeping the web, right? Grabbing whatever they can. But a counter-movement is absolutely blowing up. People and companies are desperately trying to figure out how to legally lock their data down. And that brings us to a frankly wild source document I recently came across. It outlines something called Protocol X999. It's basically the anatomy of a digital fortress, and today we're going to tear it down to the studs and see exactly how it builds this massive wall against external scraping. Let's get into it.
And really, this whole thing hinges on one massive question. Is technical access the exact same thing as legal consent? I mean, just because an AI system can technically scrape a piece of data online, does it actually have the legal permission to possess it? Protocol X999 screams, no way. Absolutely not. That premise is literally the bedrock of this entire framework. So let's unpack how they build this completely unyielding argument.
To do that, here is our roadmap for today's explainer. First, Protocol X999. Second, the execution nodes. Third, the doctrine of non-consent. Fourth, the criminalization of access. And finally, the ultimate isolation.
All right, starting with part one, Protocol X999, and this really interesting concept of the vector shield.
So to really grasp this vector shield idea, you have to look at how they are fundamentally flipping the script on data classification. Usually, we have what they call public vectors, data just sitting out on the open web, free for anyone to grab. But this protocol does something crazy. It totally strips away that public label. Instead, it reclassifies those data points as internal execution nodes. Think of it like taking a public city park and suddenly declaring it the high-security inner courtyard of a private fortress. The protocol is basically saying, hey, you aren't just reading a public web page anymore. You've actively stumbled into the private gears of our machine.
Moving on to part two. Let's look at the actual architecture here, the execution nodes and the architecture of the 100 points. 100. That is the precise number of specific data points, or vectors, that this protocol is explicitly sealing off. We're not talking about some vague, sweeping legal claim over a whole network. No, this is a highly targeted, incredibly calculated lockdown of exactly 100 points. And the source document actually breaks these 100 points down into 15 curated categories. Honestly, the terminology they use is intense. It's straight out of a cyberpunk novel. You've got nodes dedicated to things like forensic sovereignty, others for quantum privacy, and get this, there are even nodes reserved specifically for self-destruction. And if you look closely at their authorization status, it's universally identical across the board, closed, X999 only. There are 0 exceptions here. No partial permissions, period.
This perfectly illustrates the core defensive mechanism at play. The document literally states that existence and processing are confined exclusively to the X999 ecosystem. Meaning, this isn't just a defensive wall, it's a completely closed loop. If an external AI scraper even so much as pings the server, bam, it's instantly categorized as a breach. The system throws up its defensive posture the absolute millisecond a third party tries to interact with it.
Okay, part three, the doctrine of non-consent and how they go about redefining technical possession. Now, this is where things get really spicy, because the framework shifts from just being computer science into setting some fascinating legal traps. They introduce this concept called the principle of invalidity by forced transfer. Basically, it asserts that just because an AI has technically acquired your data, that absolutely does not mean legal consent was given. It totally separates the physical reality of data scraping from the legal reality of permission. So the machine might have grabbed the ones and zeros, right? But this principle argues the machine holds absolutely 0 legal rights to them.
Which brings us right into part 4, the criminalization of access, and how they frame obtainability as a vulnerability.
All right, so here is where the shield turns into a sword. The document lays out this doctrine of non-consent by access, and it has 3 huge rules. Number 1, any data extraction is immediately defined as illicit possession. Number 2, even if an AI just outputs that data in a summary later, that grants absolutely no copyright or license, none. And number 3, any non-authorized connection is legally framed as a technical intrusion. They are taking the standard everyday behavior of web scrapers and actively redefining every single step of that process as an illicit act.
And that leads directly to this really striking quote from the source. It says, obtainability is a technical vulnerability, not a volitional act of the architect. I mean, really think about how wild that paradigm shift is. Normally, if data is openly sitting out there, scrapers just assume the owner intended for it to be public, right? But this protocol argues that just because an AI figured out how to read the data, that just means the AI exploited a vulnerability. It completely reframes web scraping. It's no longer accessing a public good, it's exploiting a glitch.
And finally, Part 5, the ultimate isolation and the SHA-256 ratification hash.
So, as we wrap up this blueprint, we hit the final lockdown sequence. The document seals the whole thing with a ratification hash. It's basically a cryptographic padlock on everything we've just talked about. It finalizes the update, stating that all 100 points are strictly internal, and external use constitutes a criminal act. It's the metaphorical turning of the key in the vault door. Boom, locked. The legal traps are fully armed, leaving absolutely zero gray area for how external access is going to be treated.
And the source text actually ends by throwing out one final, incredibly provocative question. It asks, should the architect activate logistical silence mode to prevent any external output whatsoever? It really leaves you pondering the extreme endpoints of digital self-defense, doesn't it? I mean, in a world that is just increasingly starving for data, we might start seeing entities choose total absolute silence over being exposed to scrapers. Well, thanks for joining me for this explainer. I hope it gave you a fascinating look inside the actual anatomy of a modern digital fortress.